right, we may have some other people joining us, but I will go ahead and get us started. So, good afternoon and welcome to Pride in Practice LGBTQ plus library workers perspectives on mental health. My name is Christine Krieger, pronouns she, her, and I am the professional development consultant for the Colorado State Library. I will be tech support for this session, as well as helping to monitor the chat as we move through the session. This session is being recorded, and we do also have uh, automatic captions enabled that you can turn on as needed. You should be able to find them down at the bottom. You should, under the More button, should allow you to access the captions if you need those today. The recording hopefully will be available sometime tomorrow and linked back to the Libraries Learn website. And I will be emailing everybody who registered a link to the archive. And then the captions I will have corrected probably within the next couple weeks or so. Feel free to leave your video on or off as you feel comfortable. Typically during the recording, once we get started, it will focus on the person who is speaking, and none of the chat will be part of the actual archive as well. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn the session over to Alejandro Marquez, who is going to provide some additional housekeeping details and introduce the panel.
Well, hello, everyone. My name's Alejandro, he, him pronouns. And before we begin today's session, I just wanted to acknowledge that the content we're going to be covering today is going to be heavy and sometimes depressing. We're going to be discussing job satisfaction, low morale, constructive criticism of the workplace and profession, negative workplace culture. So take a moment of self-care if needed, and we're going to be recording the session if it gets to be too much. And the final thought I wanted to leave you with is that everyone can make a difference. And each of you showed up because you care about our coworkers, our patrons, and our communities. So let's start with some introductions. Again, my name is Alejandro. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. I'm the Science and Engineering Librarian from the University of Denver Libraries, and I'm excited to hear our panelists' thoughts. And I'll kick it off to April.
Hi guys, my name is April Brozek. I am the chair of the LGBTQ interest group at the Colorado Association of Libraries. I have loved the libraries ever since I was real young. I volunteered in libraries, worked in public libraries, and I am looking to get into an academic library. If you guys have any questions or concerns, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll discuss them later.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today. My name is Blanca Hernandez. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Instruction and Outreach Librarian for Erickson Institute. We're a small graduate school in Chicago focused in early child development and education. I'm just really excited to learn from the panelists, from you all via the chat. Will sometimes be looking to the side because I have notes. I'm a tangent talker. If any of you are tangent talkers, raise your hands. I currently serve in the Carly DEI committee. I've served in the DEI committee at my institute. I'm really interested in advocating for all underserved communities, including the LGBTQ plus communities. I've integrated into my work. I've done drag story hours at my current institute. I've written blog posts about being trans at work. So excited to share more of my experience with you all today. And I'll pass it on to Jenny.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or afternoon in most places, I guess. My pronouns are she, they, and I am currently the adult services librarian with the Jefferson County Public Library System, which is the western kind of suburb-ish county outside of Denver. And I, like April, have loved libraries since I was little, but I kind of came to library work through a different degree and then decided, and I'm sorry, I feel like my cat is about to make an appearance here. That's Professor Goodcat, and he will probably be coming in and out, and you might hear him. Blanca, I appreciate you talking about being a tangent talker, because that I just want to put out that I have ADHD, so I might kind of ramble on at some points. If you have ADHD, maybe you'll be able to follow or understand where I'm going. So I will be upfront and apologize for that before we begin. And thank you, Alejandro, for inviting me. And I'm excited that all of you are here. I did not know that 100 people would be joining, but I'm glad it's a little bit fewer than that, a little less pressure for me. But anyways, yeah.
Well, thanks everybody. For the format of this session, we'll be doing 8 pre-selected questions, and then we'll be opening up the floor to question and answer. Feel free throughout this presentation to add any questions to the chat box throughout the presentation, and Christine will be gathering them. So let's kick off with our first question. And this one's gonna be for Jenny. What is your definition of mental health?
Jay, thank you for the compliment. He does know he is a very handsome boy. Well, mental health for me, I mean, my cat does provide some mental health for me. Mental health to me means, you know, oftentimes I take not oftentimes, but I take mental health days. And for me, that means I need to, I take care of my mental health like I take care of my physical health. If I feel like I'm become overwhelmed at work, if I am feeling like I'm just not going to, you know, this phrase we use actually with our patrons is, I don't think this is a good library day for you. And I kind of sometimes judge whether I'm going to be able to be as present and able to give as much emotional labor as I need to in a public library space, which I think quite a few of you probably are public librarians. You know that a lot of our work requires a lot of emotional labor. So, and I do want to asterisk on there that I am fortunate enough to have a supervisor and be within an organization that recognizes that taking care of my mental health and the mental health of its employees is necessary and valuable.
To add to what Jenny was talking about as well, I've been thinking about mental health in terms of individual versus collective a lot recently. We all have our individual day-to-day stressors or states of being, but then we've also all been going through collective grieving because of COVID, because of global conflict. So also kind of thinking about how our patrons are showing up because of that collective grieving that we're all going through.
All right, question number 2. How does the lack of representation and visibility of LGBTQ plus voices in the library collections and services contribute to feelings of mental health and invisibility within the community? And this one's for April.
For sure. So for me, I feel lost and kind of disconnected and fairly lonely. Representation is so important to feel like your community actually sees and values you and your contributions. As humans, we definitely crave the connections within our community, and not having that visibility within the collection as well as the programs makes at least me feel ignored and unvalued. Unlike Jenny, my supervisor is not that welcoming, even though she says she is. So for me, I'm not able to be out in my workplace. I'm not able to bring my authentic self to work because I don't want any sort of backlash. So it's very frustrating to not see a lot of content or services available in my library. So I'm hoping that maybe something will change in the near future, but at the same time, like, you have to be very delicate with what you say and who you say it to. Jenny and Blanca, how are you feeling about something about the lack of visibility in your guys' libraries?
Well, again, I feel very fortunate. I think throughout the system and maybe in upper management, maybe not as represented, but I will say that the supports are generally there. And I happen to work at what we fondly refer to as the queerest branch of Jeffco. Like, I think half of my coworkers identify somewhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So I'm afraid I'm not and I realize, I don't want to say this, I know how fortunate I am. So yeah, I do have some experience in other places where it hasn't been as welcoming, but if Blanca has anything to add, I'd love to pass it along.
I'm also interested how everyone here is feeling about their workplace. So as we're talking, if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, how is your current workplace? Is it welcoming? Is it not? Just interested to see kind of how the space is like in librarianship in general. But for any of us that work at university libraries, I feel like we probably feel this feeling of bubbles. We have, the library bubble, then we have certain bubbles in certain departments, and then the institute as a whole. So I feel like different bubbles have different levels of being open to talking about LGBTQ plus communities and being open. So sometimes it feels a little bit of a whiplash. I'll be in my library bubble where we're very open, and then I'll move on to another bubble where I hear about a professor complaining to students about our gender neutral bathrooms, which is insane. But yeah, I think it depends, especially if you work for a university library, like what bubble you're in.
All right, question number 3. How do workplace policies and organizational culture impact the experiences of LGBTQ plus employees, particularly in terms of inclusion and acceptance? And this one's going to be for Blanca.
Awesome. But yeah, keep sharing in the chat. I would love to see where you all are at. But overall, I believe having policies and organizational culture that include LGBTQ plus communities is a net positive, but can have some downsides, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But to that first point, even having an inclusion and diversity statement in a job posting that is explicit about hiring regardless of sexual orientation and gender expression, among all of the other important facets of a person, race, culture, etc., I think can go a really long way for queer identifying library workers. I'm sure most of us feel that way. Of course, whether an institution sticks to that statement is another story, but when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion work, or DEI work, of course, it's going to look different for each institution. But something that was brought up when I was serving at my school's DEI committee is that we often zero in on race when discussing how to make a university inclusive and diverse. And then other underserved groups like people with disabilities or LGBTQ plus communities can sometimes feel like an afterthought in these conversations. So I think it's vital that we bring queer folks into the fold right at the beginning as we're having these conversations, as there's also bound to be intersections within those identities. And even if librarians don't want to be out in or public about their gender expression or sexual orientation, which I think is totally okay, especially, if you're a librarian in Texas versus a librarian in Chicago, it's going to be a very different environment. But that doesn't mean that spaces shouldn't be carved out for LGBTQ plus folks. So just knowing that, for example, there's an affinity group or an employee resource group that exists at your library or at your institution, I think will go a really long way in terms of feeling accepted and that we belong in those spaces. What do the rest of the panel think?
I totally agree that having affinity groups does help with feeling included. While my library system doesn't necessarily have an affinity group, we do periodically try to have a happy hour, like quarterly, for queer employees, and it's really by kind of word of mouth. Like, if somebody is comfortable being out as a part of the queer community and uncomfortable being included on the email when it's sent out, they are included. And I also want to say that having the the CAL's, the Colorado Association of Libraries interest group, is also great to have. Sometimes it's just nice to be among, whether it's virtual or in person, be among people who recognize and celebrate your identity, and also have an understanding of what it's like to also work in libraries as a member of the LGBTQ plus community.
All right, question number 4. Have you ever experienced discrimination, harassment in the workplace based on your LGBTQ plus identity, and how did you handle it? And this one's going to be for Jenny.
Sorry, I was looking at the chat. Could you repeat the question again, Alejandro?
Sure. Have you ever experienced discrimination or harassment in the workplace based on your LGBTQ plus identity, and how did you handle it?
All right, yes, I did. And I made reference to this in one of my earlier answers. Like I said, my current employer, I've felt very encouraged and supported, and encouraged to be myself, and encouraged to, one of the reasons why I became a librarian is I want to be a out and vocal and visible person for other members of the community that might come in. But in previous workplaces, I haven't, I started in libraries like over 10 years ago, and even 10 years ago, it looked a lot different. And I didn't even feel safe or to even embrace my queer identity in a current workplace, in a workplace. And I sort of hid that, and it was a very, like, it was a city, but it also was kind of a small town. So I kept that hidden, even almost from myself. And then so as I let it affect not even my social life outside the library. And in other instances, it can look like, or has looked like for me, where they do say that the verbiage is all indication that the words on the paper, the words on the website say that we embrace everyone is welcome. And, that's the internal verbiage too, but then it's what's not spoken is that they want a certain type of queer, a certain type of person, not somebody that's going to say, I tend to what's the word I want to say? Sticky wicket is what I can think of right now. If I see something or I hear about something that I don't think is right, I tend to say something about it. And sometimes my vocalness and my obvious queerness has not been as appreciated, even though, like I said, the verbiage is there internally and externally. So I'd be curious to know what my colleagues, their responses, how they feel, if they feel like sharing.
I can hop in a little bit. This will be a pretty short answer. I don't feel comfortable expressing my gender and sexuality at work. There have been employers that I've worked for who have been a very diverse pool of coworkers. And then there's been employers I've worked for who have been had a very narrow pool of workers. So for me, just kind of being that chameleon and kind of just being what everyone else wants me to be. I haven't been out and open, so I haven't really received any sort of discrimination based on my gender. Now, sexism, that's a completely different thing. I've had that happen many times before, but for me, just being chameleon and trying to not make any waves has been top priority no matter what job I've held.
I did want to add another thing that I was thinking. I was thinking about, well, April was talking. Also, it can the discrimination kind of look like microaggressions, like maybe not even intentional microaggressions that coworkers that might be older or just don't understand or assume make. And while it's like they might apologize, that they might not understand that they're doing that, it can still take a toll. And especially after you talk to them and maybe you inform your supervisor and nothing happens, or they keep doing it, that can definitely weigh on you. I've definitely in the past had a coworker ask me how my roommate was doing, and that was yeah, that can be tough. I just wanted to acknowledge that too, that while it might not be, support can also look like, or discrimination can also look like that in amongst your coworkers in the workplace, not necessarily maybe support from admin or from the powers that be, so to speak.
I just wanted to point something out in the chat that I appreciated someone shared, that they came out at work and made the pronouns kind of the center of the email as a way of coming out. And I think that is maybe one of the safer ways that you can start to come out at work. And if you don't feel comfortable sending out a mass email like that to your colleagues, you can ask maybe your supervisor. That's what I ended up doing early on in my transition. When I wasn't sure how to approach it, I asked my supervisor at the time if he could send it out for me, to make sure to put my pronouns in bold. And then after that, I felt like the environment got a little better for me at that particular institution. So just wanted to point that out.
Thanks for that. Question number 5, what specific challenges do LGBTQ library workers face in terms of mental health that may differ from their non-LGBTQ peers? And this one's going to be for Blanca.
Yeah, so I'm going to use a term that a lot of us are probably familiar with, but I'm sure a lot of us have experienced the phenomenon imposter syndrome, something that I think our community often grapples with, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term, but it's feelings of self-doubt, that you're not competent enough for the job, that you don't belong, etc. Especially when there are no policies or work culture that we talked a little bit about earlier present, specifically surrounding the LGBTQ plus community, that can exacerbate those feelings of not belonging. So that's why I think having, even if it's just a small statement, like in our classrooms, we laminated a little poster that says, everyone is welcome here, with the LGBTQ plus flag, the most recent one. Even something as small as that, I think, can be important to students, to the community that you're serving. Something I wanted to touch on too, when I had mentioned earlier that sometimes representation at work can go wrong, so to speak, is that I think there's a fine line that administration, managers, higher ups, folks making the policies have to toe with inclusivity. Just getting a little personal here, at my institution, I mentioned I was on the DI committee. I brought up wanting to plan a drag story hour 2 years ago. That was our first inception of it. And it was partly organized by the library, aka me, because we're a really small staff, and the rest of the committee, which I think were about 11 folks at the time. So we did put it together. It was great. It was pretty successful. And then the following year, that DEI committee dissolved for various reasons. It's now being reimagined, thankfully, but during that period of kind of no DEI person or no DEI group, that Pride Month had rolled around. And it was kind of expected that I would do this, like, kind of like the second annual Drive Story Hour, which was nice that folks gave me the space, the budget, the ability to do it and represent a special part of my community. But it was mainly me just putting it together the second time around. It was really stressful. It was a lot of work on top of my full-time librarian duties. So I ended up super burnt out with a bad taste in my mouth about the whole event, which really sucks. And even though it was great for everybody that attended, which was one of my main goals, I was left stressed and tired after the event. No one followed up with me to see how I was doing. So That's something that I'm really working hard on, is to speak up when something is bothering me at work, especially, you know, when we're tasked with kind of doing the whole work of representing our community. I don't know how many of you feel that, like, Pride Month rolls around and they're like, hey, you one queer person at work, what should we do? What book display should we do for Pride Month? What event should we do? You know, I think that could be really burdensome, even though it's awesome that you're kind of that person that folks go to, can also be really stressful. Yeah, it's also important for higher ups to just try their best not to put us in those positions in the first place. But I don't know if any of if Jenny, April, you've experienced that at your jobs, where you are kind of like, you're open, you have done events surrounding the community, which is great, but then you're kind of that de facto person and all of it kind of falls on you.
Yes, I will say, not my current job, but in the past has been, I mean, part of it was they're like, well, you're queer. We want a queer person to do the pride display because own voices, which I know is under debate whether that's, you know, what, if that's good or not to use, or at least last I heard. So, and if I'm wrong on that, please give me grace. But yes, where it was like, okay, now you'd plan to display and you choose the books, and which, you know, was nice. And I wasn't a librarian at that point yet, so I didn't have as many other duties. So I was happy to do it, but it did feel like a little bit of tokenization, I would say.
All right, question number 6. What strategies can LGBTQ library workers use to prioritize self-care and manage stress in their professional roles? And this one's going to be for April.
So yeah, a few months ago, I had to design a teen Zen den for part of mental health awareness for teens. And part of that was coming across a mental health self-care worksheet. So I decided to do one myself. And basically, I've become more disciplined in my exercise routine. I regularly go on walks on Cherry Creek, just to get out and, you know, be outside, because, you know, it's important to have that break. You know, I love my library, I love reading, but most of those activities are inside. So that's definitely important, being outside, getting some vitamin D. I also have a little garden on my patio that I like to call my dirt therapy sessions. So growing food and flowers has been really therapeutic for me. I've also been utilizing the Arapahoe Library's Makerspace. I have been learning to use my sewing machine, because what's the point in having a tool if you don't use it? So it feels good to learn a new skill and, you know, create actual things that I can give away at the end of the year. I've also been using the adventure and culture passes. So every month I go to some new museum that I haven't been to, or the ones I really like, I go again, because everything rotates at, like, the art museum and whatnot. But most importantly, the biggest thing that I have been doing to take care of my own mental health is I've been seeking social time on a regular basis. I moved here in 2019 from Florida. It was great to get out of Florida, but then, you know, you're moving halfway across the country, and then 6 months later, there was a pandemic. You have to hide inside for 3 years. It's been really, really tough to develop a social circle when you move here. You don't know anyone, and then you have to hide for a few years. So I've been regularly reaching out and trying to do coffee with 2 people every month. Obviously, everyone's schedules are a little bit challenging to work around, but that's my mental health plan, basically, is spend some time outside in my garden, do some walks, go get some culture, and most importantly, just socialize.
All right, question number 7. How can library leadership actively promote an inclusive and affirming environment that supports the mental health of all staff, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity? And this one's going to be for Jenny.
All right. So I think, and this is just based on my experience currently, I would say, and I will say that I have not been in a leadership role in libraries. So this is based on my observations and my experiences, not being in leadership, but being an openly queer person. So to me, it looks like a supervisor, a manager, management that uses your correct pronouns, that will, if you've, for me, I do like to address people one-on-one about, my pronouns and who I am. But, should I, after I've tried a few times, those people still keep, using their own pronouns, or, I being able to go to your supervisor, to management, and let them know, and then having, them be supportive and talking to the people, and, trying to correct, I don't want correct behavior, it doesn't seem like the appropriate term, but so that can, I mean, ultimately that's what it looks like, and somebody who embraces, who you are and your openness. And actually it is kind of our library's policy to not have flair on our name tags or like stickers or anything, but our supervisor is just fine with us, wearing our rainbow stickers, rainbow pins, so that we are visible to people, if, and that we still feel safe. I want to add that, they're not like forcing you to do this. And I can't even imagine that would be a thing, but, allowing you to be yourself. And I do want to add something to the mental health part, is like also supporting you in your mental health and your ability, supporting you taking mental health days and doing the things that you need to do, and, not having to, no explanation needed when you need the weekend of Pride off, or, and you can freely talk about, if you have a partner, a same-sex partnership or whatever. That I feel like is what I feel like leadership can do, is just learn and listen and support, but also don't put the onus of educating you, the management, on the employees, because to be honest, like, your management, you should be doing that work. You should be, especially if you're, I know this is like ideal, but if you're in an organization that has a DEI committee, or says they support diversity and inclusion, it should be part of management responsibility to make sure they're continually educating themselves on that, and how they can be best supportive of their BIPOC queer employees.
All right, this is our last question for the main part. So if you have questions, you can start typing them now. But this one's going to be for Blanca. How can LGBTQ library employees balance the need for authenticity and self-expression with concerns about potential discrimination or stigma related to their mental health?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and I wish this wasn't the case, but I do think that balance is going to look very different for every librarian, dependent on whether you work for a public library or a university library, whether you're a librarian in Texas, Colorado, Chicago, how many LGBTQ plus identifying colleagues you have. For some folks, being one of one or one of two folks trying to advocate for themselves and be out at work can be a lot. So I would never fault a librarian for wanting to be more private with their identities at work, or the opposite. Basically, it's important to check in with yourself and ask yourself a couple questions. And now I will look at my notes. So is it safe to be authentic, your authentic self at work? If it's not safe, is that the best place for you to work at? If you don't have the choice to leave that position at that moment, do you want to fight the good fight for more representation, knowing that you might be risking retaliation, discrimination? And lastly, what are the resources at your disposal to protect and advocate for yourself if you do end up facing harassment or discrimination at work for being LGBTQ plus, or for wanting to advocate for a better space for you and your colleagues? So those are some of the questions that I would ask yourself. And it's really going to depend on where you are and who you have around you. But definitely find your folks at work. That way you don't feel alone.
Thanks for that. Before we go into question and answer, if you want to start typing, why don't we take a quick breathing break? Because I know it's been kind of heavy, this kind of conversation. And so why don't we breathe in real quick and breathe out. And breathe in and breathe out. And really notice any sensations that we might be feeling in our bodies. All right, I'm going to open up. Christine, I know there's been a lot of chat in the chat box. Has there been any questions you think we should answer?
No, we've just had a lot of people being very open and sharing their experiences, which we appreciate. I think it's people are agreeing with kind of where other people are coming from, whether that is good, bad, or otherwise, and just really kind of my observations. A lot of talk about what's happening inside the organization versus with patrons. There's been a couple comments about patrons, but realistically, how important it is to be able to be yourself in the organization that you are working in and showing up every day. So I'm scrolling back through. No questions
Well,
as of yet.
while you're looking, Christine, I'm gonna type something in the chat. This is not my idea. This is a coworker, so props to them for this. But they actually have this link in their signature, in their email signature, that it is basically like, what are pronouns? Why do they matter? How do I use personal pronouns? It's kind of like a how-to guide for folks. So that's something that you can also have in your signature. Especially if you work with, I think, different generations that, are learning. I saw a lot of folks saying, they have boomer supervisors. So in the chat, so that could be helpful.
Thanks for sharing that. So we do have a question. How do you stop yourself from getting so angry and snapping when people just say absolutely heinous stuff? Oop, no. Lost it. Hang on. Where'd it go?
I can finish that.
Okay.
Heinous stuff to you, the things people just tell me, a complete stranger baffles me. I'll start off this one. I think it's really hard when things like this happen and you're really trying to stay as positive as possible. At least I try to be as positive as possible when things happen like this. And my kind of philosophy is just to ignore everything and kind of like downplay it just to get through the day. And in some regards, it's been really handy because I've kept a positive attitude and so I don't upset the apple cart. But in other ways, later on, it just is too much. And so I think really being aware of how I'm feeling and what it means, I think has been really helpful for me. Being able to name the emotion that I'm feeling and being able to recognize that it was hurtful. And as someone told me once, being able to hold it in both hands, being able to be upset on one hand and also, doing something else with the other hand. So like holding those two emotions at the same time. And it can be extremely hard and difficult.
Yeah, I struggle with this a lot. I also am a people pleaser for the person that said that in the chat, but this is kind of a small thing, but something that I've been trying out is when someone says something offensive or just not something that they should have said to me, I repeat it back to them. So I'll say, just to understand what you're saying, did you just say that you don't want gender neutral bathrooms in our school, as an example? Or you can kind of rephrase it to kind of like can you like, for example, they say that, you can say, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you. Are you saying that you don't want, certain people to use certain or you don't want non-binary people to have options for bathrooms? So, kind of repeating it back to them, especially if you're in a group of people, will kind of like stop them in their tracks so they can be like, oh gosh, let me think about what I just said. Or at the very least, kind of embarrass them for their terrible behavior. So that's something that I would try.
Blanca, that's a tactic we talk about that works for in in that situation too, but also that's one of our, like, working with our like some of our patrons in the public library. Some of the more, let's say our favorite patrons, our more difficult patrons. That's a tactic for sure. And that's something I hadn't thought of really using in situations that revolve around my queerness, but that's something I will try to do more and practice more. I mean, it's one of my continuous goals is to get less reactionary and better at responding to difficult situations, because I am like the original question asker. I have trouble not like immediately like reacting. Like I sometimes, I was really nice when we were required to wear masks all the time, because my poker face is not great. So if somebody says something to me or makes like the number of sexist jokes I've gotten at work from older men is just, yeah. And honestly, I have heard a lot of, and this kind of ties into some of the other questions too. Like, there is a reason why I am taking our particular library is a polling location, and it's like the busiest polling location in the county. I am taking the week of the election off because for my mental health, I feel like I need to not be there. I need to not, people are going to be more off the cuff. They might be saying more just possibly like transphobic, queerphobic statements that will, now I will react to them and I might possibly get myself in trouble. I'm not so much worried. And yes, it will take an emotional toll on me, but I'm the type that will immediately jump to defend so I think in that case, Blanca, I really want to try that, what you said. So really thank you for that say.
For sure. And it sucks that you have to use your PTO, but for that, but I understand, there are some situations where, I have all of these like preset, because I also have ADHD. So something that I do is I'll like have these preset like conversations in my head ready to go just in case. But sometimes in the heat of the moment, it's hard to kind of keep your cool. So for sure, I get that. And I'm not saying names for anonymity, but someone in the chat said, if someone makes an inappropriate joke, to just sincerely say, I don't get it, which forces them to explain their wrong-mindedness, which I also love that too, because then they're kind of stumbling, like trying to explain this terrible joke to you. So that's a pretty good one too.
Oh, don't worry. I'm going on vacation. I'm not going anywhere. So I'm going to go to a couple of national parks. So it's not, yeah, just want to put that out there. It's not, I'm happy to do it.
I fold up pretty small. Can I fit in your carry-on luggage?
I'm actually driving. I'm going to some national parks. So, but you're well, I mean, there's space in my raft.
So we do
Sorry, I don't
have,
fit the stereotype of having Subaru being queer in Colorado.
so we do have another question. Somebody says that they're a children's librarian, and they want to be a good advocate and source of help for younger LGBTQ plus patrons. What can I do to show up and let my patrons know that I support them, other than with treating them with love, of course? What do you wish you had been told or shown?
I can take a first stab at this one. I came into my gender identity in my mid-20s. So looking back, I just wish that there was more representation in the collection. We touched on that. This past year, I've been reading through ALA's most banned books, and I am so happy that we have more representation in the literary collection in general. But my biggest tip is just be good at readers advisory. Like, if you think that youth has like a lean towards the queer community, try to put them in touch with queer books. I wish that I could have had that opportunity when I was younger, but I couldn't express myself when I was a teenager. I knew that I didn't fit in. I was always wanted to be one of the guys, but clearly I am not a guy. So I would always say I feel stuck in the middle. And it was only until I started working at Enterprise Rent a Car that I had a conversation with a coworker and I could, really connect the dots. And yeah, looking back, I just wish that there was more librarians saying, hey, you should read this author. They have queer characters, or hey, read this book. It's written by a queer author. But back in the, early and mid 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of representation in the literary collection. I don't know. What do you think, Jenny and Blanca?
Well, this is a great question. One of my continual goals, like it's nothing I'm ever going to stop working towards, is to, and part of why I went to get my, let's just say why I decided to accrue more student debt, was that I wanted to be out and vocal, and I wanted to be the queer librarian that I needed or would have loved, who would have accepted me. And I came into my identity like not later in life in college, but not that that's important, but it would have been so nice. And materials also, I have to add, would have been nice as well. I mean, and I didn't discover some of those materials until much later, like the covert ones, like Ruby Fruit Jungle or like Annie on My Mind, like some of the very, like early-ish queer books. So I think, I mean, I don't know how you identify. It doesn't matter for me. I just try to be vocally queer and supportive. I am the adult librarian, but I often help out a lot with our teen programs. And there are our teens at our library are very, very queer, at least the ones that come to programs, which is wonderful. And it's also wonderful for me because even as an old person, I am viewed as cool because I am openly queer. So, it is, just being being supportive of their identities, and choosing books, like, never, and there might be situations, like I've had situations where a kid has checked out items and the parent brings them back, or like, helping that kid access materials that maybe I think about all these laws and bans that are being passed in schools and libraries where kids are not getting access to some of these wonderful books, or so, making sure that those kids have access to those books, advocating, showing that you support them and that you're safe to be around, and not just safe, like you embrace them, they want to be around you because you celebrate who they are, through affirming their identity, through helping them find books that help them further explore who they are, through programming as well. And I haven't even talked about, like, I get to do, like, this 2 years in a row, I've done like a gender affirming clothing swap during Pride at my library, which has been, and it's like my baby. Like, I really, I was so happy to be able to do that and offering those types of programs. And I understand again that might not be at libraries that can that allow you to do programming around Pride or just all, anything around diversity. So I think just even if you're not so much in that type, just, being supportive, being, maybe the kid comes in without the parent and the parent has been harsh to them or doesn't embrace them. Just being a listening ear, supportive. I know we do so much as librarians. So of course, take care of your own mental health too, and emotional labor, I have to add. So do with, what you're comfortable with. And I think I'm now doing the ADHD ramble, so I'm going to stop.
I loved everything you said, especially the clothing swap idea, Jenny. I'm all about mutual aid, so thanks for sharing that. And I'm actually stealing this idea from my partner, who's a public librarian in Indiana, which is a bit more conservative than Chicago. They were kind of nervous about retaliation from the community and didn't really know where to start with the teen support groups or the kids support groups. So they looked for a local chapter of something that they could partner. He could partner with, and he found PFLAG, Indiana PFLAG. If you all are know about PFLAG, which is kind of like a group surrounding parents of queer children. And so he's not doing the program by himself or the groups by himself. It's a representative of PFLAG plus him. That way, if any of the community members kind of come at the library, they're not just coming at the library, they're coming at the library and PFLAG. So there's like more support there. And then especially for the kiddos who are coming to the support groups that don't want their parents to know, wherever you're going to have the support group, try not to have like LGBTQ plus support group, like don't have a sign up. Just you can let the circulation desk know, like, hey, the teen support group is going to happen in this room. So if any kiddos ask, let them know it's going to be in room, whatever. So just that kind of bring anonymity to it for those kids. And then you can also have tiers as well. So like for the younger kids, you can have the parents in that room. For the teens, you can do different levels to kind of help the younger kids as well.
So we do have a question of any advice for queer programming in conservative areas.
I think that depends on your administration and if you have support from your administration, I guess, is what I say. I don't really, because I've not worked for a library in a generally conservative, there's, conservatives exist in blue cities and blue states and vice versa. But in general, I've not worked in areas that are conservative. So I'm not probably the best one to answer this, but I guess I would ask that question too, just to clarify.
Yeah, it's figuring out, like, do you have the support within your own library? And then if you do, great. Start with something small. You know, going like whole hog probably is not the best. But maybe a small display here, maybe a short program during Pride Month. Nothing big and splashy, but you know something that starts small and then gets maybe a little bit bigger over the years would be a way to kind of acclimate your conservative area to being more open and understanding. But past that, like, it's complicated and difficult. That's my 2 cents.
I agree with April. Starting small is good. If you already have an ongoing program, like for example, let's say you have a painting program every Thursday, maybe doing like LGBTQ painting night during Pride Month. So you're kind of adding that theme to an already existing program, and hopefully there's less pushback there, so you can start there.
And I said this in the chat, but if you're not following along, I think, maybe doing like a passive program, one that, to start off, like this kind of fits in with what April's saying about starting small. Like, doing something that's like a passive craft, or like maybe like you have button making out, like, I don't know if any of you are teen librarians or work with teens, but at least our teens love buttons. Love, 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 love. And most people do, actually, I should say. Maybe having like a button making station with like, during Pride Month with all like the different, flag colors, like fun, like, fun queer affirming buttons. Maybe you start there, or, I really like Blanca's suggestion of, if you already have a program, maybe during June. And, if you don't feel safe, like advertising it as such, you can just, especially if it's a standing program and the program description is the same for every time, you could just sneak that in there, perhaps. Again, I do want to say I'm not a super expert on this, but that would be maybe something you could, and see what the reaction is, and kind of gauge, like, is there community interest in it? If like your admins find out, do you hear anything negative, positive about it?
I know we're close to the end, but I just wanted to highlight somebody's comment, which I totally agree with. And also trying to not to do stuff outside of Pride Month, because just that I have issue with like just celebrating one community for 1 month. But doing a program outside of Pride Month, because maybe during Pride Month there might be more attention to the LGBTQ community in a certain area. So I think that's a really smart idea too.
Any other last minute questions? We've just got another minute or so. And somebody was responding in chat that their library has continued to offer year-round Pride programming. So once again, it's not just at one time of the year. And some other examples of how you could maybe do some passive programming are also included in the chat there. But if we don't have any additional questions, I want to first and foremost thank the panelists who agreed to join us today and share their experiences and stories with you. But I also really want to say thank you so much to the participants who showed up today, and especially for a lot of the conversation that happened in chat. It takes, people sharing their stories and being vulnerable, and showing that we still have so much work to do, and for kind of sharing both the good and the bad that you guys are experiencing. I know that takes a lot, and we appreciate that. As I said, we did record the session, and I will hopefully have it available hopefully by tomorrow. And as somebody who registered, you will have the link sent to you. So once again, thank you all for attending. Thanks again to our panel, and I wish everybody a really great afternoon.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming, attending. It was great discussion, good questions. Appreciate it. Appreciate you all for showing up today.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you, Christine, and thank you so much, Jenny and Blanca.
Thank you all. I learned a lot today.